I would love for you to give an explanation of what Children of God is, kind of how it came to be, and the basis of the whole religion.
Yeah, for sure. There's a reason that I started off uncultured. The epigraph just says the first rule of cults is you're never in a cult.
I love that line
anyone
so
that has
much.
been in sort of a toxic group can understand that. So Children of God was started in 1968 by this kind of, consistently failing wannabe preacher guy who then suddenly finds his moment on Huntington Beach during the hippie era. And if we look at a lot of cults, we see this a lot, right? Like someone that just hasn't had that much success in anything until finally they find their huge thing. Joseph Smith being a great example.
Hey.
But so he started, along with his teenage kids, using young, pretty people and music to recruit followers. And, the other thing we know is that cults pop up in time and space. And that is because when societies are getting very complicated, when people are starting to realize that the systems are failing us and the groups are toxic and we're trying to pull things down and find new ways to be and new ways to do life, people can get drawn to cults, right? Mm-hmm. And also when the world is confusing, people are drawn to cults because of clarity. And so, Children of God starts in America in the late 60s, 70s, moves over to Asia in the 80s, moves to South America in the 90s, and not moves, spreads, right? And this was kind of how the path of cults throughout the world went, and my family went right along with them. So my grandfather, after a bad LSD trip where he claims he met Satan, is sitting in a park. He's a college-educated CPA, and he's sitting in a park the next day trying to figure out what to do with his life because he's just had this very negative religious experience. And up walk the happy, bubbly Children of God. And off he goes with them and brings in his young girlfriend as well, who's my grandmother, Margarita. And her mother is so happy that her troubled daughter found something good to do with her life that she actually donates a house to the prophet. And so that's how my family became kind of important people. And my grandfather, also being one of the few college-educated followers, ends up, being in the finances of Children of God forever, still runs the money of what's left of them today. And this is how my mother comes to be in 1972, like one of the first 10 children born into this group. Now, I say that the Children of God went sex, love, and Jesus, kind of your basic evangelical Christianity. Sorry, not sex. Faith, love, and Jesus. Over to religious prostitution, pedophilia for God, and this constant preparation for the apocalypse. And the important thing to understand is that takes a decade to happen, right? And in this decade is the process of a group becoming a cult. Because what we don't talk about too much is that a cult is not just a list of qualities that a group is. It's also this journey that a cult goes on. I'm really breaking this down in my next book,
I love
The
it.
Culting of America.
Oh, yes.
And so, so it's this process of isolating your followers and gaining complete control, and then just slowly making it slightly more extreme. And there's this thing that I am coining the sacred assumption that I think is really helpful when we think about cults. So the sacred assumption in Children of God was that this random man, David Berg, was truly the prophet of God. Right. And as long as you believed that, everything he said makes sense. Right? You can justify anything. In Nexium, the modern day sex cult, right? The assumption is that Keith Raniere was the smartest man in the world, and he'd found this process for maximizing human potential that worked. And as long as you believe that, you can justify everything else.
L. Ron Hubbard, Joseph Smith, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, in the U.S. Army, we can talk about, the idea of dying for the flag, or even that America is a country worth dying for. And if you believe that, you can justify anything, right? So the sacred assumption is really this important part of getting to ends justify the means mentality, which is kind of when you're in your end game, when you're really and truly a cult. But but it's this process, right? And so I say that really what set David Berg aside from just all your other kind of hardcore, high demand evangelical Christianity that was coming up at that time. His mother was an evangelical revivalist in Florida. And all he did was he took purity culture and control of sex and he flipped it. Mm-hmm. And he went from sex is bad, sex is only supposed to be in marriage, sex is, all the things that evangelical purity teaches you. And he just switched it to, no, sex is love, right? And God is love and God made sex. And therefore sex is for everyone, including children. Oh. And, it became this like free love thing. And we just do what we do and the world doesn't understand it. But of course it wasn't free love. It was forced polyamory. And, there's this other thing that we don't talk about too often, but I think is pretty important, is that purity culture and pedophilia culture are two sides of the same coin, right? Mm. They are both obsession with the sexuality of young children and especially young girls. You and I growing up, me and the sex cult and you and Mormonism likely had a ton of similar experiences regarding our sexuality and our bodies and how we were taught to think about it, and similar impacts in our lives today, even though we come from these sort of what seems to be opposite sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think the overlap there is the shame, where you're just always, you feel ashamed of your body. You feel like it doesn't belong to you. You feel like it's the property of men, usually is how it goes. And there's just no ownership. There's no self-sovereignty, which is what I mostly talk about, right? Is self-sovereignty. And I think that's the hardest part. And so I'm really interested to also get into more of this reverse purity culture thing, because we talk about purity culture so much on this channel and the damage and the harm that it causes. I think it's important because there's such a fine middle ground where I often get comments of people saying, oh, what do you want? Just everyone to go around and sleep with each other? I'm like, no, that's not what I want. I don't want people to be super obsessed with sex. I don't want people to think that sex is of Satan. I just want people to have a normal, healthy sexuality, kind of like our own biology, what we're programmed to do. And so I'm excited to talk about, from your perspective, what happens when you flip and you go to the opposite side, because it's not good on the other side either, guys. We're not preaching one extreme or the other. We're saying find that middle ground.
Yes, exactly. I will say this all the time, and it's a big theme in my book, Uncultured, is that anytime a group is trying to legislate sex between consenting adults, like, it's complex, it's problematic. And that is basically every religion, every branch of the military, many companies, right? Like most universities and schools. And just like you said, people always go, oh, what? So you don't think we need to have any laws protecting any people? And it's like, no, but I have never seen a group legislate or regulate sex and put any emphasis on how complex this is and how easily it can be abused.